Are you ready to launch your podcast, but you're stuck on what to name it? Or maybe you don't know how to write your podcast description to really draw your listeners in? That's what we're going to talk about today. And if you need help with launching your podcast, you can grab my free resource, which is my podcast launch roadmap. And it has everything from setting your podcast foundations all the way until launch day. So make sure you grab that free resource. Okay, if you're new here, my name's Liz Chapman. You're going to want to go back to the last few videos where we have been working through our podcast foundations. And today we are talking about naming your podcast and writing your podcast description. Okay, so let's go over do's and don'ts for naming your podcast. First of all, you want it to be clear. You don't want to have a cutesy name, because what happens when you have a cutesy name is people don't know what it's about. And if they don't know what it's about, they're not going to click on the link to listen. So let's use an example. If I have a podcast that's about podcasting and I name it Amplifying Your Voice with Liz Chapman, that's pretty vague. That could mean a lot of things. That's not very specific. So on the other hand, if we name it something really obvious like Your Guide to Podcasting, now, which is more clear to you? Amplifying your voice or your guide to podcasting? If it's your guide to podcasting, that to me is very clear that I should be learning about all things podcasting if I were to listen to that show. So when it comes to naming your podcast, yes, you can be clever, but you want it to be clear. Being clear is much more important than being clever. If your podcast shows up next to somebody else's and yours is cutesy and clever and theirs is clear and straightforward, I'm going to guess they're going to listen to the one that's clear and straightforward, and they're not going to listen to the one that's cutesy and clever. Another thing with your podcast name is you want to have keywords. So there are very few areas inside a podcast player that are searchable for SEO. And the name of your podcast is one of them. So if you have, let's say you're going to talk about macros, if you're in the nutrition and wellness space, and you have a podcast all about macros, and you know that one of the key phrase words is, of course, macros, that needs to be in your podcast title. Whatever is the most important keyword, have in your podcast title so that when somebody is searching for that topic, macros is going to come up. So very important. Number one, we're going to have a clear and simple name that makes sense and it conveys to your listener exactly what your podcast is about. And then number two, we are going to use a keyword or keyword phrase in our podcast title. Very, very important. Let's use some examples. So my client, Andy Hart, her brand is called She Sells Differently. If we just titled her podcast She Sells Differently, that does convey that somebody is going to learn different marketing techniques than what's traditionally talked about. However, to clear that up, we titled it She Sells Differently, Authentic Selling and Business Strategies for Faith-Based Female Entrepreneurs. That's very clear. It's faith-based, it's for females, and it's selling and business growth strategies. Those are all big keywords that we were able to add to her podcast name so that when somebody is searching within the player, if they're searching keywords like faith-based, female entrepreneur, growth strategies, her podcast is going to show up under that search for that. Another thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to research podcast names. You want to make sure that somebody's not already using the name that you have, or that it's not super close to the name you want to use, because it can get confusing if you want to send somebody to your podcast and if it's like somebody's podcast is whatever.com and you do whatever.org. Something like that, it's just not going to work. You do not want to be in a competing space with somebody with the same podcast name as you. So there are resources that you can use to search for podcast names to make sure that you're not going to utilize a name that's already been used. And you also want to make sure that when you're titling your podcast that you check trademarks and make sure you're not using a name that's already been trademarked. So if we go back to Andy's podcast name, She Sells Differently, that tagline that we use, Authentic Selling and Business Growth Strategies for Faith-Based Female Entrepreneurs. That was our tagline to get those extra keywords in, to be very clear about what her podcast is about. So you can use on like your marketing, the title She Sells Differently, But then in your podcast players, have that tagline that has those extra keywords in it for visibility. And then also with your podcast description, this is another area that's searchable within the podcast players. So you want to infuse keywords into that as well. You do not want to stuff it with keywords. That's not what we're doing. We're picking our top keywords that we want to be found for, and we're strategically placing them in our title, in the description, and then other places inside the podcast host, so that when somebody's searching, that these keywords will come up. And then in your podcast description, you want to talk about what your show is about. I like to add a section titled, "This podcast will answer questions such as," and then I go into Google and I figure out what questions those listeners are searching for, and then I turn them into questions and we add those into their podcast description. And then you also want to have ways that they can contact you. Do you want them to follow you on Instagram, on TikTok? Put your website so that they can contact you through your websites. Just have some way off the podcast player platform for them to be able to get in touch with you. I hope that was helpful. Today we talked about adding keywords into our podcast name and into our podcast description. If it was helpful, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any more episodes. Next week, we are going to talk about designing eye-catching cover art, and there's a strategy to that as well. So you're going to want to tune in for that to hear what all the strategy is about our cover art. And if you found this helpful and you need some more guidance, you can grab my step-by-step guide on how to launch a podcast. It's called Launch Your Podcast Roadmap, and it's a free resource for you. See you next week.